Ukraine's President Zelensky has signalled he may call up 450 to 500,000 men to ensure his country's victory against Russia. We're in Kharkiv again, and this is a scene of yet another Russian strike. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor of The Sun newspaper, and this is your roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We'll start with President Zelensky's announcement that he's considering mass conscription. He said in a press conference in Kyiv that he was looking at proposals from his military to mobilise between 450,000 and 500,000 men and women to fight against the Russian invaders in his country. Now, this is significant, and this is going to be a theme really of today's update, because it's about the war of resources. Not much moving on the front lines. Russia has been making some gains in the northeast and in the east around Bakhmut, but the front lines as we go into this winter, as we go into this Christmas period, pretty much frozen. No expectations really by either side, I think, of a significant breakthrough through the winter. Certainly that's the opinion of Western officials, Western analysts. So it's really, to this update, we're looking at what's happening behind the front lines again, but crucially what's happening in terms of resourcing both armies. Zelensky talking about this mass mobilization. Important because he is signalling that he is gearing up for a long, sustained and difficult fight. Russia also gearing up in a different way for a marathon war rather than the sprint that perhaps Putin had first envisaged when he invaded nearly 2 years ago. Russia has already announced a partial mobilization. They did that in the first year of the war, of some 300,000 men. The speculation that Vladimir Putin needs to announce a second wave of mobilization, but he's reluctant to do that for two reasons. Principally because of the backlash, the public backlash that it risks causing across Russia as the war becomes a reality for more and more people. More and more families risk losing their sons and their daughters to this bloody conflict. Speculation as well that Vladimir Putin won't call any more mobilization before the election scheduled to take place in Russia in March, which he has said that he's going to stand. It's a foregone conclusion. He's going to win. He's going to cement his place in the Kremlin, potentially for another 5 or 6 years. At the same time as both sides looking for more men and women to fight, they're also looking for the cash, the resources, and the weapons to fight, the money they need for those weapons. And we're going to focus on the challenges Ukraine has been having to get that money. Two of its biggest backers, the United States and the European Union, are both struggling to get the money they want to give to Kyiv, and that's for various sort of political wrangles. In America, the White House has put forward plans for a $60 billion aid package. Now, since the war started, America has given Ukraine about $100 billion in aid. So that's about $50 billion a year. And what President Joe Biden's White House has proposed was another $60 billion, effectively to see Ukraine from about now through, one would imagine, the next 12 months. But that has been blocked by the US Congress, by Republican opposition politicians in the US Congress, ostensibly for two reasons. They claim that there is no plan, they see no plan from the White House for Ukraine to win this conflict. But we know that it's also tied up in US domestic politics. They want to see more from the White House to support their demands for a border fence, better security on America's southern border with Mexico to stop migrants crossing into America on the southern border. So essentially, this is domestic political wrangling in America, which has held up aid for Ukraine. Ukraine's First Lady, Elena Zelensky, has said that their country is in mortal danger without this money. There were hopes, dwindling hopes, that this would come through before the end of the year, but we've heard from leaders on both sides of Congress that actually this debate has now been pushed until next year. So that American money not coming until January at the earliest, and as a consequence of that, we've already seen Ukrainian soldiers, commanders saying that they are trying to conserve weapon use, ammunition use, expenditure on the front line, so that what they've got lasts them that bit longer. Now, it's been a similar story in the European Union. The EU had put forward plans to give Ukraine 50 billion euros, a similar sort of amount of money, but that was over 4 years, so a slightly different timescale for that money. That was approved by all but one of the EU's members. It was Hungary, and principally Hungary's leader Viktor Orban, who vetoed that proposal, sparking some anger and fury from his fellow European Union leaders. France's President Macron urged him to act like a European. We saw some of the Nordic countries announcing their own initiatives. Indeed, Norway said it was raiding its own stocks of NASAMS air defence systems to give them to Ukraine quickly, so that it could protect key cities, key infrastructure from Russia's nightly missile and drone bombardments. We saw Denmark talk about its own 1 billion aid package. The World Bank and indeed the EU, through a different mechanism, both announced 1.5 billion euros and dollars respectively aid packages last week, around the same time that Orban was kiboshing the EU plan. It's worth asking, why is Viktor Orban doing this? I mean, he is a populist right-wing leader in Hungary. He is a friend, it would seem, of Vladimir Putin. Indeed, one of the only leaders to have met him, certainly EU leaders to have met him since Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine. It's interesting. Orban made his name in 1989 calling for Soviet troops to leave Hungary. So in that sense, he was also a populist, but standing against Moscow. Now, he seems to define his politics by standing or often calling out the European Union, sort of blaming the European Union for Hungary's woes. And many of his policies inside Hungary have caused unease in the European Union, what's been described as democratic backsliding. As a consequence of that, the EU has withheld about 20 billion euros of money that was earmarked for Hungary. Now, on the eve of this EU summit last week, we saw 10 billion of that released. So effectively, money that had been frozen was given to Orban. As a consequence of that, or possibly a coincidence, but it would seem as a consequence of that, when the EU leaders were debating whether or not Ukraine could start accession talks to join the EU, Viktor Orban left the room rather than vote. The remaining leaders approved that proposal. Viktor Orban was absent, so that got through, but he then came back and vetoed plans to send Kyiv this money. There is still EU money that Orban wants, and there's a debate going on in the EU as to whether or not that money is enough. That's what Orban wants, whether that's enough to get him to change his mind. Meanwhile, member states are looking at ways that they might be able to channel money to Ukraine independently through other mechanisms, not requiring the consensus, the 28-nation consensus of the European Union. Similarly, the message from America seems to be that, certainly the message from the White House rather seems to be a sort of insistence. They are confident they will get this $60 billion package through, but it is going to take more political horse trading. So as Ukraine heads into this Christmas period, the conflict largely frozen. We've seen some messaging, some increasing of defences, Ukrainian forces building up their defences in some key areas. We've also seen, interestingly, some psychological operations from the Ukrainians talking about amplifying their engineers, their bridge building and their river crossing capabilities, possibly to keep Russian forces on their toes, but no expectations at the moment of any major breakthroughs on the battlefield. The place to watch, the thing to watch over these next few weeks, possibly months, is what happens behind the front lines, what happens with resources, which side can call up more men, women and military material. I mean, one point I perhaps should have made earlier, of course, is the losses that both sides have sustained, and that speaks to why conscription or mobilization is important. Russia started the war in February 2022 with about 360,000 soldiers involved. There are estimates now that 87% of those soldiers, this is a US estimate, some 315,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. The British estimate is more or less on par. About 300,000 Russian soldiers, they believe, have been killed and wounded during the course of the war, with about 70,000 killed. Estimates for Ukrainian losses are kept very secret in Kyiv, but nonetheless, the New York Times reported a figure of approaching 70,000 Ukrainians killed. Another estimate has suggested at least 25,000 Ukrainians have been confirmed killed, through funeral announcements and other open source information. The point is, both sides have sustained very heavy losses because of this conflict, because of the nature of this conflict: trench warfare, artillery bombardments, infantry assaults into urban and well-defended positions. So who can sustain that fight is perhaps going to be key. Both sides trying to arm themselves with money, men and resources, and both sides trying to signal that they have the will and the resolve to continue. We'll come to your questions. Thank you very much for your questions. And as ever, if you have them, please leave them in the comments on YouTube, and we'll endeavour to answer them next time. Question number one from Rich in Ireland was, why did Russia invade Ukraine? I mean, the question is really, was this about resources? Was it about minerals? Was it about farmland? Or was it about something else? I mean, ultimately, I think this was a decision that Vladimir Putin took himself. It was something that he appears determined to have done. The equation, the sort of geostrategic equation of, was this in Russia's best interest? Most people, certainly most rational analysts looking at this before the invasion, couldn't really make sense, couldn't see why this was in Russia's best interest. Certainly from a resource argument, certainly from a politics and international relations point of view, it doesn't make sense. Russia has enormous resources. We've seen that in terms of its gas supply to Europe and how it's been able to leverage that to some extent. Really, this appears to be an attempt by Vladimir Putin to forge his legacy. He's been studying Russian history and interpreting Russian history and lamenting, in his own words, by his own admission, lamenting the fall of the Soviet Union, which he described as, I think, the worst event of the previous century. And bear in mind, that previous century included the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust. But for him, the worst thing that happened was the fall of the Soviet Union. So he's effectively trying, in some sense, to recreate the USSR, trying to reclaim Russia's past glories, reclaim territory, which in his mind he sees as Russian. And he's made it very clear that he does not see Ukraine as a sovereign nation that has a right to exist outside of Russia. Question number two from Nathan, thank you very much, was about Ukraine's domestic weapons production. Are they making weapons themselves? Should they be making more weapons? It's a really good question because it relates to what we were just saying a second ago. Under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was home to a number of key weapons factories. Indeed, it manufactured some of the USSR's most sophisticated missiles. It housed many of the USSR's nuclear weapons. It does have, and indeed it did have, a sophisticated arms manufacturing industry. A lot of that was put on ice when Russia invaded. Of course, a lot of those sites are vulnerable to missile and drone attacks. These are sites that long-standing factories have been there a long time. Russia knows where they are. They're vulnerable were production to restart. Having said that, we have seen Ukraine manufacture a huge number of drones. I've seen this being done in a sort of cottage industry level in people's apartments with 3D printers. I mean, really quite extraordinary, the level of mobilization that ordinary people are going to help the war effort. But we also know manufacturing is happening on a larger, more industrial scale at secret locations across the country. And one of the messages from President Zelensky when I met him in Kyiv last month was that he wants to partner, Ukraine wants to partner with Western arms manufacturers to license their products, but to manufacture them in Ukraine on sort of finance arrangements. Obviously, Ukraine's economy is under pressure, but he's saying if you can't donate the weapons, if you can't give us the money, then give us the licenses, the authority to manufacture them ourselves, and we will sort out a financing agreement so that we can pay for them further down the line. So it's a good question. Can Ukraine manufacture its own weapons? It wants to. It's something it's trying to do more and more. And indeed, in the last few days, we've seen British Aerospace announce that it is sending, or it's supporting, the maintenance of Ukrainian weapons with Ukrainian staff inside Ukraine. So that appears to be an acknowledgement as well that it is possible for these international arms manufacturers to operate in Ukraine to try and keep them in the fight. And finally, third question was about Swedish Gripen fighters. Is Ukraine going to receive them? These are the Swedish Air Force's sort of primary fighter jet. We've heard a lot about Kyiv wanting American F-16s, and when there were various different options on the table, some people had suggested that the RAF might send its Typhoons. That's a version of the Eurofighter. Suggestions that Eurofighters might be sent in, suggestions that French Rafale jets might be sent in. The message from Kyiv then was that we want F-16s, and that's for a couple of reasons, but principally there's a lot of them in Europe. A lot of them in America. Air forces have surpluses, or at least spare capacity, which they would be able to donate to Ukraine quickly. But the Gripen is still on the table. Ukraine's Air Force spokesman has said that just a few days ago. They're still looking at that as an option. Ukrainian pilots, we understand, have sort of flown them to experiment with them, and Sweden is still considering sending them. And my understanding is there are different generations of these jets, and certainly some of the older ones, which Sweden is looking to phase out as it updates its Air Force, may well be available for Ukraine. The advantage of the Gripens is that they are perhaps more robust. They can fly off runways which aren't necessarily up to the same specification that an F-16 would require. F-16s need very, very clean runways because if debris gets sucked into the air intakes of any fighter jet, it can do enormous damage to the engine, so it can't fly. The Gripens, we understand, were designed for dispersal. One of the risks of any air force is that airplanes tend to need runways. Runways tend to be on air bases. These are big locations which are easily visible from space, which are known to enemies before conflicts start, that can be destroyed. So aircraft need to disperse, and one of the solutions to that is to use roads, highways, alternatives to runways, and that could be a key advantage that the Gripens would offer Ukraine that the F-16s wouldn't. So it's, we understand, still on the table. And one final thought to end off this update: as you celebrate this holiday season, as you celebrate your Christmases, Ukraine will be celebrating its Christmas on the 25th of December for the first time. Earlier this year, they announced that as they separate themselves, ideologically from anything that tied them to Russia as a consequence of religious and cultural ties, as a consequence of the USSR, they've moved the official date of Christmas in Ukraine from the 7th of January, when it's traditionally celebrated by the Orthodox Christian Church, to the 25th of December, when it is celebrated by the rest of the Christian communities around the world. So to the soldiers in the trenches, to the civilians across Ukraine, we wish them a very happy Christmas. Thank you again for watching and listening. If you're on YouTube, please don't forget to ask your questions in the comments below, and we will endeavour to answer them next time. If you're listening, please don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts for the latest news on Ukraine.